The message arrived at 300 hours, Earth Standard Time, and it did not knock. It bypassed every firewall, every quantum encryption layer, every security protocol the United Earth government had spent 40 years building. It simply appeared, sitting in the most classified server on the planet like it had always been there, like it belonged. The AI monitoring system flagged it 3 seconds after arrival. By the time Director Halima Voss was pulled from her bed and rushed to the emergency intelligence bunker beneath Geneva, 43 analysts were already staring at it with pale faces and very still hands. The message was written in perfect English, not translated, not approximated, perfect. It read, "You have expanded without permission. You have made agreements without authorization. You have touched stars that do not belong to you. The Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds hereby summons a representative of the species known as Homo sapiens to appear before the full council no later than 60 standard cycles from the timestamp of this message. Failure to appear will be interpreted as hostility. Compliance will result in the orderly renegotiation of Earth's status within the galactic community." There was a pause in the room, a long one. Then senior analyst Tamaz Reyes quietly said, "They called us a species." "They called our expansion unauthorized," Director Voss replied. Her voice was flat, the kind of flat that meant something dangerous was being held very tightly underneath. The debate that followed lasted 11 hours. Politicians wanted to celebrate first contact with a governing galactic body. Military advisors wanted to mobilize. Scientists wanted to know everything about the council immediately. But it was Ambassador Yara Osei who ended the debate by walking into the room at hour 12, setting her coffee down and saying simply, "They didn't invite us. They summoned us. There's a difference, and how we respond to that difference will define the next 1,000 years of human history." Osei was 54 years old. She had negotiated 3 trade wars, 2 territorial disputes in the outer colonies, and 1 situation on Titan that was still classified above the director's clearance level. She had dark eyes that missed nothing and a smile that had made harder beings than politicians deeply uneasy. She volunteered to go alone. The argument against that was loud and immediate. Alone meant vulnerable. Alone meant they could make her disappear. Alone meant Earth had no witnesses. Osei had listened patiently and then said, "Alone means they'll underestimate me. And right now, that's the only advantage we have." She left 6 days later aboard a single diplomatic shuttle. No weapons, no escort fleet, no military posturing. Just one woman in a well-pressed suit with a briefcase, a personal data pad, and a small photograph of her daughter tucked into her breast pocket. The Galactic Council station appeared on her sensors 18 hours out, a structure so enormous it had its own gravity well, a ring-shaped megastation wider than Earth's moon, orbited by hundreds of vessels from dozens of species. Lights everywhere. Traffic. Civilization, ancient and self-assured and utterly convinced of its own importance. Osei looked at it through the viewport for a long time. Then she straightened her jacket, checked her reflection in the dark screen beside her seat, and opened a channel back to Geneva. "Director Voss," she said, "confirm Aegis Protocol is standing by." "Confirmed," came the response, "awaiting your signal." "Good." She closed the channel and leaned back in her seat. "Let them think I'm alone." On the station, the Zenthari reception delegation watched the tiny human shuttle approach. Their intelligence files said humans were emotional, short-lived, and prone to poor decisions under pressure. The lead diplomat, Counselor Vethra, studied the shuttle's dimensions, barely large enough for a crew of 1, and felt something very close to contempt. She had dealt with dozens of developing species before. They always came the same way, nervous, hopeful, eager to please. She expected the human to be grateful, just to be allowed through the door. She activated the docking protocols and prepared her most patient, condescending smile. Somewhere in the asteroid belt of the Sol system, 214 human warships powered down their reactors, went dark, and waited. 3 weeks before Ambassador Osai's shuttle ever left Earth, a file was opened in the deepest intelligence archive of the Zenthari Dominion. It was labeled in their language with a phrase that translated roughly as, "The loud children of a minor star." Senior intelligence analyst Varath Sol had been assigned to compile the complete profile on humanity, and he had been doing this job for 30 years. He had written profiles on 62 species. He was methodical, dispassionate, and deeply proud of the fact that he had never once been surprised by the conclusions his data led him to. He was about to be surprised. He started, as always, with biology. Humans were carbon-based bipeds, average lifespan of 80 to 100 years, short by galactic standards, where most council species measured their natural lifespans in centuries. They were physically unimpressive. No natural armor, no venom, poor night vision, limited sensory range. Their muscle density was notably higher than most sapient species, which Varath Sol noted as a curious evolutionary artifact, but nothing strategically significant. He moved to history. This was where things became strange. The first anomaly. Approximately 74,000 years ago, humanity had nearly gone extinct. A supervolcanic event, the Toba catastrophe, their records called it, had reduced the entire global population to somewhere between 1,000 and 10,000 breeding individuals. By all statistical models, a species that reduced to that bottleneck should either perish entirely or recover so slowly that meaningful civilization development would be pushed back hundreds of thousands of years. Humans had rebuilt a global civilization in 70,000 years, from a population of perhaps 3,000 individuals. Varath Sol flagged this as unusual and kept reading. Second anomaly. Roughly 600 years ago in their timeline, a series of conflicts so catastrophic that humans themselves named them world wars had killed hundreds of millions of their own kind. Chemical weapons, strategic bombing, the deliberate engineering of starvation. By the time the second such war concluded, 2 of their cities had been vaporized by nuclear weapons, a technology they had developed and used on themselves within the same decade they discovered it. Most species who reached nuclear capability either never used it, or used it and didn't survive. Humans used it, survived, then spent the next 80 years building enough nuclear warheads to destroy their planet 17 times over, and somehow never used them again. The deterrence mathematics alone made Varath Sol stop and recalculate twice, because he was certain he had made an error. He had not made an error. Third anomaly. Climate destabilization. Beginning approximately 250 years ago, human industrial activity had pushed their planet's atmosphere into catastrophic warming. Mass extinctions, coastal flooding, agricultural collapse across entire continents. At the peak of the crisis, human civilization should have fractured, resource wars, population collapse, societal breakdown. Instead, within 60 years, they had not only stabilized the atmosphere but developed carbon-negative industrial systems, relocated 40 million coastal inhabitants, and used the crisis as the forcing mechanism for the global governmental unification that eventually became the United Earth Government. They had looked at the end of their world and used it to finally agree on a common tax code. Varath Sol sat back from his workstation. He looked at the 3 data points sitting in front of him: near extinction event, catastrophic self-inflicted warfare, civilizational climate collapse, and in each case the recovery curve did not look like other species' recovery curves. It did not slow and flatten as resources were depleted and populations stabilized. It steepened. Every time something had tried to end humanity, humanity had come back faster, more organized, more technologically capable, and this was the part that made Varath Sol's secondary heart beat slightly harder, angrier. There was a psychological profile buried in the appendix, compiled by a xenobiologist who had spent 3 years on Earth. It contained one paragraph that Verathsal read 4 times. Humans do not respond to existential threat the way most sapient species do. Where other species show increased risk aversion, social fragmentation, and reproductive conservatism in the face of near-extinction events, humans show the opposite: increased cooperation, elevated aggression toward perceived threats, and extraordinary bursts of technological innovation. The mechanism appears to be an emotional state they call anger, combined with a cognitive pattern they call spite. In humans, the near destruction of everything they love does not break them, it focuses them. Verathsal wrote in his report's conclusion, "Recommend standard compliance protocol. Species is pre-stellar in geopolitical maturity and unlikely to pose meaningful resistance." He submitted the report. Then he sat at his desk for another hour, staring at the steepening recovery curves, before quietly adding a personal note visible only to himself. "I hope the Council knows what it is doing." The Council Chamber of the Galactic Council of Sovereign Worlds was designed to make visitors feel small. This was not accidental. The architects, Zenthari of course, had spent considerable effort calibrating ceiling heights, lighting angles, and acoustic properties to ensure that any species standing in the central floor space would experience a measurable physiological stress response. The chamber seated 400 delegates from 17 sovereign races. Their tiers rose in sweeping arcs above the central floor, so that whoever stood in the middle looked up at a wall of alien faces staring down from every direction. Ambassador Yara Os walked into the center of that floor and looked around with the calm, politely interested expression of someone who had just arrived at a moderately impressive museum. She had slept 8 hours the night before, she had eaten a full breakfast, she had called her daughter. Councillor Vethra opened the session with the practiced gravity of someone who had performed this particular ritual many times. She recited Earth's violations in precise detail: unauthorized terraforming operations on 4 moons beyond Earth's designated sphere of influence, independent trade agreements with 3 non-council species, the development of faster-than-light communication relays that had not been submitted for council review, and this delivered with particular weight: the deployment of what Zenthari intelligence classified as a significant military fleet without council knowledge or approval. The chamber listened. Delegates murmured among themselves. Osai stood in the center of the floor and listened with her hands folded in front of her. When Vethra finished, she asked, with the tone of someone extending extraordinary generosity, whether the human representative wished to respond before the council delivered its determination. Osa said, "Yes, thank you, I have one question." Vethra gestured permission. "Has the council," Osai said, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's excellent acoustics, "reviewed what happened to the last 3 civilizations that attempted to impose restrictions on Earth's development?" The silence that followed was textured. It had layers. Then someone laughed, a Zenthari delegate, the sound high and dismissive. Others joined. The laughter spread around the tiers, comfortable and contemptuous. Vethra smiled. "There is no record of any civilization imposing restrictions on Earth. Humanity was unknown to the galactic community until—" "Yes," Osai said simply, "I know." The laughter stopped. Something about the way she said it, quiet, not threatening, simply certain, landed in the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Delegates looked at each other. The Zenthari murmured. A species called the Thurak, whose bodies registered emotional information through electromagnetic field fluctuations, physically recoiled from something they were sensing in the human's biometrics. Osai thanked the council for their time. She said humanity would give the matter serious consideration. She smiled, turned, and walked out of the chamber with the same unhurried ease with which she had entered it. Behind her, Vethra looked at her deputy and said, "Prepare the fleet orders." Her deputy nodded. "The advisory fleet moves to Sol in 48 hours. "Good." Vethra turned back to the chamber. "We'll give the humans 3 days to process the shock before we open formal subjugation proceedings." 3 levels below the chamber, in a small private communications room she had requisitioned under diplomatic courtesy protocols, Osai sat down, opened her data pad, and sent a single burst transmission on a frequency the Council had no idea existed. It contained 2 words: "Aegis activate." She then closed the pad, stood up, and went to find something decent to eat, because she suspected the next several weeks were going to be very busy, and she believed firmly in never beginning a war on an empty stomach. Admiral Korethvel had commanded fleets for 31 years, and he had learned in that time that the most dangerous moment in any military operation was the one just before you realized you had made a catastrophic mistake. He did not know he was about to live that moment as he brought his 40 warships out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Sol system. He had expected traffic, human vessels, commercial, scientific, military, moving through their home system in the routine patterns of a modestly developed civilization. He had expected orbital stations lit up and broadcasting. He had expected to be detected, challenged, and then met with the anxious diplomacy of a species that had just realized it had pushed too hard against powers it couldn't match. Instead, there was silence. Not the silence of an empty system. His sensors confirmed the system was occupied. Structures on the Moon, atmospheric processors on Mars, asteroid mining operations throughout the belt, but no signals, no active sensor pings, no running lights, nothing moved. "They've gone dark," his sensor officer reported, and there was a note in her voice that Korethvel didn't like. Not fear, something more careful than fear. Confusion threaded with professional unease. "Emergency response," Korethvel said. "They're panicking, hiding." He had seen this before: smaller species faced with superior force, shutting everything down and hoping the threat would pass over them. It was almost sad. "Move us in system. Standard formation. Begin broadcasting the Council's formal authority notice." The fleet moved. They were 4 light minutes into the system when Korethvel's sensor officer made a sound that she had never made on his bridge before. It was a very small sound, almost nothing. "Admiral," she said. Something in her voice brought him out of his command chair. The display she was looking at showed the asteroid belt. It had always shown the asteroid belt: irregular rocks, mining equipment, ice. But now, as the fleet's passive sensors finally processed the full data they had been collecting since entry, the display was updating, populating. Shapes were emerging from the noise that were not rocks and were not mining equipment. They were ships. Not a few ships, not a patrol fleet. The computer was still counting, still tagging and classifying, and it was already past 80, past 100. "They're in the belt," his tactical officer said quietly. "They're behind the moons. There." He stopped, swallowed. "Admiral, there is a cluster of approximately 30 vessels running inside Jupiter's upper cloud layer." Korethvel stared at the display, at the shape of what was emerging. The human vessels were positioned, not randomly, not in any defensive cluster he recognized, but in a 3-dimensional web that surrounded the Zenthari fleet from every angle, above and below the ecliptic, fore and aft. Every firing solution already solved, every approach already owned. They hadn't gone dark because they were hiding. They had gone dark because they were hunting, and they had been waiting, cold and patient and perfectly still, for exactly this moment, for the Zenthari fleet to move far enough into the system that the geometry was perfect. Korethvel had one thought, very clearly, before the human vessels began to power up. The report said they were emotionally volatile. It said nothing about this. On 214 human warships, reactor cores came online in sequence. Running lights activated, targeting systems illuminated, and on the open channel that the Zenthari fleet had been broadcasting on, the formal authority notice still playing on loop, a new voice cut through. Calm human, unhurried. Zenthari Advisory Fleet, this is Admiral D. Young Cho of the United Earth Defense Command. You are currently inside our weapons envelope. Please do not move. We would prefer not to have to explain to your families why you didn't come home. There was a pause. We will wait, Admiral Cho added pleasantly, while you think about this. The Battle of Sol System lasted 6 hours and 14 minutes, and it was not a battle. Battles implied two forces meeting with equivalent intent. What happened in the Sol system on that day was something else, something that military historians would argue about for a century and ultimately agree had no precise precedent in galactic warfare. It was, most accurately, a demonstration. Admiral Korethvel made the mistake of ordering his fleet to fight. He did it because he was a proud commander with 31 years of experience and 40 warships that were among the finest in Zenthari's service. And because in his career, he had never once backed down. And because the intelligence files had said humans were emotionally irrational in combat and would make mistakes under pressure. The files were half right. Humans were emotional, but their emotions in combat had been refined over 10,000 years of warfare into something that functioned more like a precision instrument than a liability. The first human strike came from the belt, kinetic impactors moving at a speed that the Zenthari point-defense systems were not calibrated to track, because no species in the Council used that delivery method at that velocity. They were rocks, accelerated rocks. But rocks moving at 22 kilometers per second do not need to be anything more sophisticated than rocks, and they hit 4 Zenthari vessels simultaneously in the same 3-second window, stripping drives and weapon arrays with appalling accuracy while leaving life support and hull integrity untouched. The Zenthari returned fire. The human ships were not where the targeting solution said they would be. They had moved not randomly, but in patterns that the Zenthari tactical AI classified as chaotic before a junior human officer, who would later receive a commendation, figured out the patterns were calculated to make the AI classify them as chaotic. The Zenthari fleet's salvos hit empty space with clockwork consistency. Meanwhile, human boarding pods, small, fast, almost invisible to sensors, were attaching to disabled Zenthari vessels and deploying technical teams. Not soldiers, technicians. They moved through the crippled ships with practiced efficiency, locating and disabling backup weapon systems, pulling power cores offline, and sealing themselves back into their pods and detaching before the Zenthari crews had fully organized a response. They did this with a speed that suggested they had rehearsed it many times. They had. By hour 3, 14 Zenthari vessels were adrift. By hour 5, it was 31. By hour 6 and 14 minutes, when Korethvel's own flagship lost drive power in a strike so precise it avoided every single crew compartment, the count was 40. All 40 ships, every vessel in the advisory fleet, disabled and drifting in a system they had entered expecting to intimidate. Not one of them was destroyed. This was the part that Korethvel found most difficult to process. His fleet was helpless, and the humans had done it deliberately, choosing at every engagement point to cripple rather than kill, to disable rather than destroy, as if they were making a very specific and carefully considered point. The open channel crackled. Admiral Korethvel. Admiral Cho's voice was exactly as calm as it had been at the start. Korethvel had spent the last 6 hours trying to hear something in it: rage, satisfaction, cruelty. He heard none of those things. He heard a man doing a job and doing it competently, which was somehow worse than all of those things. Your fleet is broadcasting rescue beacons on standard Council frequencies. We have not interfered with those signals. The Council will be receiving them now. Korethvel said nothing. I want to tell you something, Cho continued, and I want you to hear it clearly because it's important. A pause. We chose not to kill your people today. Every weapons solution we executed was designed to leave your crews alive. That was not an accident, and it was not weakness. It was a choice. We are very good at making different choices. Another pause. When you report back to the council, and you will report back, because we are going to send repair teams to restore minimum drive capability to your vessels, please tell them exactly what you saw. Tell them how long it took. Tell them how many of your people survived. And tell them that the humans said they hope the council will think very carefully about what it does next. In the council station, 40 light minutes away, the Galactic Council watched the battle feed in silence. No one laughed. A Thurak delegate was making a sound that translated, roughly, as the noise a creature makes when it realizes the thing it has cornered is not cornered at all. Councillor Vethra sat very still and said nothing for a very long time. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened 18 hours after the last Zenthari warship was towed to a stable orbit. There was no formal agenda. There was no prepared protocol for this situation, because this situation was not supposed to exist. The Council had not seriously contemplated military defeat at the hands of a pre-Council species in over 400 years, and the last time it had happened, the species in question had been absorbed and pacified within a decade. The Council's institutional memory had no useful vocabulary for what it was looking at. What it was looking at was the full battle footage, played 3 times at the request of 3 different delegations who were certain they must be misunderstanding something. They were not misunderstanding anything. The Zenthari called for answers. Their intelligence division produced Varath Sal, who stood before the Council's emergency committee and delivered the most uncomfortable briefing of his career. He showed them the recovery curves. He walked them through the 3 civilizational collapse events. He put the steepening post-crisis acceleration graphs on the main display and watched the delegates stare at them. A Melvari council member, the Melvari were ancient, cautious, and deeply disinclined to panic, asked a quiet question. Are these curves standard for their species or exceptional events? Varath Sal said, they appear to be standard. Every major civilizational stress event in their recorded history produced an equivalent or greater acceleration in capability and cohesion. The Melvari member was quiet for a moment. Then, so every time something nearly destroyed them, they came back stronger. Yes. And they have experienced how many such events? Varath Sal pulled up the full list. Major extinction threats, 4. Global-scale warfare, 3. Civilizational collapse events, 2. Significant biological pandemic events, 6. Ecological destabilization events, 1. Successfully reversed. The chamber was very quiet. Then Dr. Shalvas, the Zenthari xenopsychologist who had spent 3 years on Earth and whose report Varath Sal had read, stood up without being called and said, I need to show you something that was not included in the official intelligence summary. She displayed a single graph. It showed human technological development speed. It had 2 notable features. First, the baseline rate was already faster than most species at equivalent development stages. Second, and more relevantly, every single crisis event in human history corresponded with a dramatic spike upward. Disease, war, climate, each one, every time. Other species, Shalvas said, when faced with existential threat, enter preservation mode. Resources are hoarded, reproduction slows, innovation contracts. This is rational biological behavior. You do not experiment during a survival crisis, you conserve. She looked around the chamber. Humans do not do this. In every crisis, their innovation accelerated. Their cooperation increased. Their willingness to sacrifice short-term individual survival for long-term collective survival expanded. They built their nuclear deterrent during the aftermath of the wars that nearly destroyed them. They solved their climate crisis while undergoing its worst effects. They developed faster-than-light technology in the same century they first established orbital spaceflight. A Thurak delegate's electromagnetic field spiked visibly. Why? What drives this response? Shalvas said simply, they get angry. and then they get organized. In humans, these two things happen together, and when they do, they are extraordinarily difficult to stop. She paused. The Zenthari files classified humanity as emotionally volatile and therefore unstable. This was a misreading. Their emotional volatility is not instability. It is acceleration fuel. The harder you push a human civilization, the faster it moves. She sat down. The council chamber remained silent for almost 4 minutes, which was, by galactic parliamentary standards, an eternity. Then a Melvari delegate said, very quietly, to no one in particular, "We summoned them." Ambassador Os returned to the council chamber 11 days after she had left it. The room was different this time. The lighting felt less calculated. The delegates in the tiers above sat differently, less arranged, more gathered, the way beings sit when they are genuinely uncertain of what is about to happen. Councillor Vethra was present, but she was no longer at the center of the Zenthari delegation. She had been moved one seat to the left. A small adjustment. It said everything. This time, Osei was not alone. She entered through the main delegate entrance, and behind her came representatives of 11 species: the Thurak, the Kalori, the Venish traders of the Outer Ring, the Dramit, and 7 others whose names the major council races had barely learned, because they had never mattered enough to learn before. They walked with her in a loose formation that somehow did not look casual, that somehow looked the way a fleet looks when it is moving with a shared purpose. The council had not invited them. They had come because Osei had, over the course of 3 months of quiet diplomatic work that had run in parallel with every crisis, asked them to. She stood in the center of the floor. 11 delegates arranged themselves in a semicircle behind her. She did not wait to be given the floor. "The United Earth government," she said, "has reviewed the council's proposed terms." She set a single data chip on the floor in front of her. No one moved to retrieve it. "We decline them entirely." Her voice was even, her face pleasant, her eyes moving across the tiers with the methodical attention of someone who was counting and finding the numbers satisfactory. "In their place, we propose the accord of equal sovereignty." She outlined it with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed this moment many times and had absolutely no intention of being interrupted. The accord restructured the council's voting architecture to eliminate single-race veto power. It established mandatory representation thresholds for all species. No species could be classified as a protected world or client state without the affirmative consent of a majority, including at least 4 minor species delegates. Resource agreements required negotiated terms, not council imposition. Expansion rights reverted to individual species discretion, with only conflict resolution mechanisms retained at the council level. It was, in structural terms, a complete dismantling of the Zenthari-dominant council architecture that had governed galactic politics for 200 years. When she finished, the chamber exploded. The Zenthari delegation came to its feet. 3 other major race delegations erupted simultaneously. There were procedural objections and sovereignty arguments, and what translated roughly as a Zenthari delegate saying this was the most obscene proposal ever placed before a civilized body. Osei waited. The minor species did not shout. They watched. And then, one by one, the 11 delegates behind Osei spoke, and they did not speak in anger. They spoke in the careful, precise language of species who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this moment and had thought about what they would say when it arrived. The Kalori delegate recalled, calmly, the 3 occasions in the past century that the Zenthari veto had blocked resource-sharing agreements that would have prevented humanitarian crises in minor species territories. The Thurak delegate presented a document, prepared, printed, formal, listing every species that had been reclassified as a protected world against their stated wishes. The Venish delegate asked a single question, directed at the full chamber. "How many of you in the upper tiers have been waiting for someone to say this out loud?" The silence that followed was different from all the other silences in that chamber. It had a texture of acknowledgement in it. I let the silence breathe. Then she said, "We give the council 72 hours to deliberate." She glanced once at Veth-Ra, who was very still in her seat. "We are, of course, patient people," Osai said and left. The vote was called at hour 68. 17 sovereign races, 400 delegates, a chamber that had not seen a structural reform vote in over a century. The Zenthari voted no, unanimously, with the formal fury of a species that had never lost anything it considered its own. The Draxi voted no. The Voreth voted no. 2 more major races who had been watching the mathematics fell in line and voted no. And then the minor species voted. 11 species who had, in aggregate, been sitting in this chamber for over 150 years without ever once tipping a meaningful vote, without ever once feeling the weight of their presence actually matter. They voted yes. And they were joined by 3 major races who had gone quiet and thoughtful during Dr. Shalvas's briefing and had spent 68 hours running their own political calculations and understanding that the shape of the galaxy was changing whether they aligned with it or not. The accord of equal sovereignty passed. Not by a large margin, but it passed. The restructuring process took 4 months. Lawyers and diplomats and political architects from 30 species worked through frameworks and amendments and compromise language. Veth-Ra submitted a formal protest that would become a footnote. 3 Zenthari officials resigned. A Melvari elder who had sat on the council for 60 years said publicly that this was the first vote she had seen that she was not ashamed of. Humanity took a single seat in the restructured council, 1 chair, equal to every other chair. Os sat in it for the first session and spent most of the day listening. When she came home, when she walked off the diplomatic transport in Geneva and saw her daughter waiting on the tarmac, she didn't say anything for a long moment. She just held her. Her daughter, who was 22 and studying xenolinguistics and had been watching the newsfeed obsessively for 4 months, asked what it had been like. Osai thought about the chamber designed to make visitors feel small. She thought about the intelligence file that had called humanity emotionally volatile. She thought about 40 warships adrift in their own asteroid belt, all their crews alive, all their rescue beacons broadcasting, because humans had chosen to make a point instead of making a graveyard. Loud, she said, and then quiet, and then it was done. On the other side of the galaxy, in the Zenthari Dominion's most prestigious academic institution, a historian named Korath Dev, nephew of the admiral, began writing what would become the most widely read document in galactic academia for the next 300 years. He titled it, A Study of the Human Anomaly. He spent 4 years writing it. He interviewed survivors of the Sol engagement. He read every intelligence file. He traveled to Earth and spent 6 months there, watching and listening. He interviewed Osai, who was retired by then, and who answered every question with the patience of someone who found the whole thing a bit obvious in retrospect. The document ran to 900 pages. Its final line was 1 sentence. They were never the most powerful species in the galaxy. They were simply the only ones who had been broken enough times to stop being afraid of it. In the Sol system, beneath an ordinary yellow star, Earth turned in its familiar orbit, blue and loud and entirely itself, carrying 8 billion people who woke up every morning and made breakfast and argued and loved and built things and broke things and fixed them and started again. Because that was what humans did. Because that was what they had always done. Because every time the universe had tried to end them, it had only taught them how to survive one more thing. Somewhere in the asteroid belt, running cold and dark and patient as stone, the fleet waited. It would always wait. Just in case. The end.